everyone. Welcome to the Ophthalmology Business Podcast. We help you develop your ideal practice with help of other doctors and experts. The topics we cover include marketing, management, leadership, recruitment, HR, mindsets, and more. I am Guido Piquet, one of the co-hosts of this podcast. Every listener of this podcast is welcome to join the Ophthalmology Business Academy at www.obacademy.org. The membership is on us, and it's our gift to you. Today, I'm excited to talk to Steve Gottfredson, VP of Sales and Marketing for Brevium. Our topic today is the science and art of patient recall. Let's jump in. Hey, Steve, how's it going?
Guido, can't tell you how excited I am to be on the podcast today.
You telling me, I was telling you earlier, I think you're a hard man to pin down. You're like really in demand. So the audience is really lucky to hear this podcast from you today. So thanks for joining.
Yeah, that's I was telling Guido when he called me to get on the podcast, I just cleared the schedule because this is something I've been wanting to do for a while.
And I think you're a lot of people, and you're a popular guy out there in the ophthalmology circle. So I think the ones who haven't heard from you are going to have a huge benefits today. So I think the honor is all on this side. So appreciate you joining.
Hey, just a very quick trip down memory lane. I got into ophthalmology 15 years ago, and one of the first places I visited was Man Eye. And if I'm not mistaken, at the time, you were running the call center?
Yeah, I've done a lot here. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me.
I mean, from my standpoint, one of the things I've always loved about just being in your network, Guido, is that you're one of these people who has literally done, I don't know if it's everything in a practice. Obviously, you're not a doctor, but
Probably pretty much everything except the doctor. So yeah, I've seen all roles, including IT. I actually started as the IT director for the practice.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's been a long road, and I do remember us in the early days talking about recall, and I think we probably negotiated a little, hopefully really well, because we got you to help us out, and we made a great team in that sense. And I think probably part of the reason, I think your openness and willingness to kind of help us find the right solution is why we've been with Brevium so long. And I know I've given you a hard time over the years, so if I've given you too hard of a time, I'm sorry, but I know you're a nice guy, so you're okay with that.
Yeah. It's funny when I came into, I've been in the ophthalmology arena now for 15 years, and just like a lot of people, just absolutely love this space. But when I got here, my exposure to ophthalmology had more to do with like being colorblind than knowing anything else about being
Yeah.
about ophthalmology. The old joke is that when you're colorblind, like before the diagnosis, I was missing all the green flags, or the old saying is I missed the diagnosis just came out of the purple. Like,
yeah. So how did you? So you brought that up, like coming in. I mean, we've been doing it for a while, but how did you get into the space?
I was with Pfizer for a long time, and this little startup company called Brevium was starting to help ophthalmology practices bring back patients that were lost and overdue for care. And just had the opportunity, because of some shakeups that were going on at Pfizer, to come over and join this team. But I was the fourth employee over here, and for a little while I was the third employee. And so I guess a little bit like you, where I've had to wear a lot of different hats along the way, ranging from just being in the practices and doing account management, all the way to getting to do fun stuff like this, like being on a podcast.
And and having good conversation about, how to make a change and how to be an industry leader. And I think that's part of another reason why I love having continued conversations and relationship with people like yourself, because, when we first started having the conversation about recall, it's completely different than the conversation that we're having today because of just the nuance of how to do it better. Um,
Oh yeah. I
and I
can't
think,
believe how much has changed.
yeah, it has. And I think the term recall is a very broad term in terms of definition and also in terms of people's understanding of what that means. I think in a bigger sense, it's like, well, it's trying to get people back into your practice. But in reality, it's a lot more involved than just that. So could you, I guess, from your experience and expertise and kind of how you've seen things evolve, can you describe really in your words, what's recall mean?
Yeah. Great question. So there are three terms that I think get used almost interchangeably when it comes to this conversation. The first one is reminder. And for purposes of today's conversation, when I think of a reminder, I think of like a reminder is like an appointment reminder, which is different than a recall. A recall is where a patient on the is not on the schedule, but there's a date on file indicating when they're supposed to come back. And that's its own unique thing. And then reactivation is kind of this third thing, which is if a patient isn't on the schedule and they don't have a recall date on file, or that recall date has gone past, and now the patient is kind of missing, what does it take to get those patients back in?
And that's, I think, clearly understandable in terms of and maybe for me too, it's been easier to understand in terms of a time sequence. Reminder, you have an appointment. Recall, you're due. Reactivation, you were due, but you didn't respond. And now we're continuing to try to get you back into the practice. And you mentioned recall date. One of the reasons that we continue to have a great relationships is I think not many people have understood the difference between not having a date and having a date, because so many people out there require a date, but Brevium does not require a date because that accounts for the human element of putting in a date. That's one of my biggest, I guess, pains in my side is when you try to develop a process for people. There's always the human element of that forgetfulness of not following that protocol that you put in place. And so my fear is losing people because of the error of human element. But can you talk a little bit about how you approach making sure that people get into that recall campaign if people forget to place a date in terms of recall?
Yeah, well, let's just talk about what makes a successful recall campaign
Mhm.
um, and how to make sure that recalls are being entered and that type of stuff. So the first thing is that, in my opinion, every patient should have a status, a very clear status in the practice management system about what is supposed to happen with them next. So that is, if the patient just came in for an appointment, you schedule them for their next appointment before they leave. If for some reason they're not willing to do that, or your schedules aren't open that far out, then you make sure that there's this date on file, the recall date, indicating when that patient is supposed to come back. Now, if for some reason you're not willing to put them into one of those two statuses, then you start there are other statuses I think practices need to be using, such as returned to optometrist, like referring up optometrist, or like PRN, and or even like inactive. Like, obviously there's these statuses like deceased, but a practice ought to be able to query their database and know exactly what the plan was for the next patient. And there's a lot of different ways to do those statuses. Like sometimes people will say, well, if the doctor wants to send them back to the optometrist, they'll usually just put a little note on file on the EMR that that's what's supposed to happen, but that's not helpful when it comes to really running a great recall program, because ideally that patient would have like a recall status of, I've seen practices say, okay, well, we'll put in a recall for 2099, the year 2099, meaning that we're not planning to bring that patient back. Or they'll put in a recall status that actually is called PRN, so that they know how to like filter out and approach those patients. Is there anything that you're hearing there, Guido, that I could be more clear on?
Yeah, I think it's what you're describing as what the practice needs to do in terms of setting up the recall system on the front end to be successful,
Yes.
which is hugely important. And I think practices need to, probably many practices don't have those protocols that when X happens, do this. When Y happens, do this. And there's an agreed upon kind of, when the doctor says come back, that's what's going to happen, and that's fine. And that works most times, but it really need to really rethink and get really focused on what that's going to be and how that's going to look, and that everyone in your practice understands that. Because I started talking earlier about the human element, which is and that's the vein of my existence, is it's great. I can make all these rules, but people have to follow them all the time. And that just doesn't happen. And so, we'll get a little bit more detail into, I think, how you handle that situation, but it's the reason why we continue to work together, is because of how Brevium approaches that challenge of I would call it, so this podcast was called The Science and the Art. Now we're starting to get to the science of how the data comes in and how you interpret the data, and how the system actually uses that data to do recall, taking into account what you just mentioned of how that practice starts and on the front end, right? So how do you input the data? How do you make sure that the system that you're using, the EMR, knows when you want? But I bet you, if I were to go into many practices, there wouldn't be an agreed upon process, or at least it's not uniformly followed all the time. So those are things that you're absolutely right. You have to consider on the front end to really think about, how do we make sure that we tell whatever system we're using when those patients are going to come back, and how are we going to follow that? That's kind of where I was going with that in the beginning.
Yeah. Well, and let me come at it from a different approach, Guido. This is an exercise that's easier said than done, but it's not too hard to do. If a practice will run a list of patients that they saw during that day and put two columns on the report. The first is date of next appointment and whether there's a recall on file. They're likely going to find some patients on that list that don't have either. And so at that point, the administrator, based on looking at the list, can pull up the individual patients and say, well, why doesn't this patient have a future appointment or a recall? And in some cases, they're going to find that they should have had one of those two, in which case they can enter a recall for that patient. And just getting the recalls entered reliably is like it's essential. And then from there, if there are these different statuses, like, well, the patient was supposed to just come in one time for a consult, be returned to the optometrist, they can start thinking about adding either a different status to the patient, or entering a recall on file, like I said, that's just a PRN recall, or a date that's like so far in the future that they know the patient's not gonna like ever be contacted for that.
Yeah, no, I agree. It makes sense. I think that's the key foundation and building blocks for a good recall system. You have to put good data in there, right?
Yeah.
The better the data going in, the better it's going to be coming out.
Yeah.
But
The,
let's talk about let's kind of dive a little deeper into like the science now, because several of our conversations over the years have really been interested in, well, what is this? What does the data say? What let's talk about, how does when you reach out at day 12 versus day 13, or does it matter how you send it? I know you've got some data that I think could probably help when it starts to, as you see trends and things that you see work the best. So, take anywhere that I know that's a broad direction in terms of how to go with the conversation, but where do you think we can start when it comes to the science and data of looking at recall?
okay, great question, Guido, and a bunch of different directions we could go on this. But let me share with you a couple of maybe benchmarks or rules of thumb that an administrator listening to this could take back to their practice. The first is that it's not uncommon to see 30% of patient volume flowing through the recall system. Practice sees 100 patients a day. Up to 30 of those patients may have been due to the recall system. And so you can imagine if like a practice doesn't have a good recall system, how if all of a sudden it like just quit working, how that could really like put the hurt on a practice, right? And sometimes practices, I feel like they accept like these holes in their recall process when they just end up like leaking patients like crazy. Um, and so I guess that's one of the first things I'd say is it's important for a practice to understand what percentage of the patients that are coming into their practice show up on the schedule because of the recall process, and for them to understand what their recall conversion rate is. So I'll give you another example of that. We looked at a practice the other day, just for simple numbers. I'll say there are 100 patients that were coming in. 30 of them were due to the recall process. But when we looked at the conversion rate that they had on their recall process, it was about 60%. That means that they're losing. I'm never do math in public and on the fly, but that means it's like they're losing about 10-15% of their patients just overall through this leaky recall process that has a conversion rate that's only around 60%. By the way, 60% is not really that bad when it comes to a recall conversion rate.
And would you say, because I think when you look, and it also probably depends on how far out, right? So if patients are closer to their due date, that percentage is going to be higher. If they're further away, it's lower.
Absolutely. There is a direct correlation between how long it's been since the patient was last seen and the likelihood that they are going to schedule their appointment. Just the longer time goes, the more chances there are that they moved, that they went to a competitor, that they, I don't know, changed insurance, like all that stuff.
Right. So in terms of like definition, and we talked about recall. So I think recall is closer to the time and the recall date of when you want that patient. Reactivation is as those patients get further and further away from their due date, then you're trying to reactivate that patient into the practice. And there might be different considerations and different strategies for both, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Just I use the example of reminders and recalls, in my opinion, are a little bit like the Ron Burgundy of
Okay, never heard that reference for it, but it
well,
sounds
the reason I
like
say
it.
that you remember Ron Burgundy
Yeah,
would read any cue card that was put in front of him on the newscast, right?
yep,
So there was that moment in Anchorman where that thing went sideways. But most patient communication platforms, they're just like, they want to just look at the system and say, oh, patient's got a recall date of May 10th. Let's send them a message either a few days before, a month before, whatever, give them an attempt or two to get them in. And the thing that gets tricky is if there's no date on file, then you have to start doing some analysis on it, right? You start having to ask questions like, well, when was the date they were last seen? Who was the doctor that saw them? Even what location are they supposed to go to? What was when they did come in a year ago, what was it for? Oh, a routine eye exam? Or was it wet AMD? Because if it's wet AMD, now they're like way overdue for care as opposed to, like, it's not just about bringing back patients who haven't been seen within a year or two. It's about being able to see the diagnosis and the disease that they have or the procedures that they've had in the past. And then the practice can set a tolerance of time to determine whether those patients need to come back in on a clinically appropriate interval of time.
Right. And you won't say it, but I'll brag for you. Is that's again the reason why we continue our relationship and recall is because you have to have the ability to do that. And there's not every recall reactivation program and platform can do that. And so I agree. And we're starting to go down the path of what makes this successful recall and reactivation campaign, which, I know that every practice and situation is unique, but maybe you can kind of share some of the best tips or best practices in terms of what makes it successful now, the actual system itself, not necessarily we talked about a practice preparing it and preparing the data.
Yeah.
But what about, how often do you reach out? How do you reach out? Is one thing better than the other? So what are some of the things you think that have seemed to work the best?
Okay, that's a very fascinating topic. And I want to start by asking you a question, Guido. I'm flipping the table here. Maybe you've seen the data around this, but when you survey patients and you ask them, how do you prefer your doctor's office to communicate with you? What do you think they say in terms of like text, email, auto calls, postcards, live calls? Like, what do patients say they want you to do?
I think it's been dependent on the patient. I think I don't get one straight answer probably from anyone. So I prefer to text me. I actually had a doctor come in here. Actually, when I was walking in the hallway yesterday, there were two doctors that were having a conversation and they were laughing about a patient that she had just seen based off of what the patient told her. She said, I wasn't going to come back in. And then I got such a heartfelt postcard from you that I just made the decision I had to come. And so she said, so they were laughing because she told the patient, well, I didn't write that. and she said, well, tell your marketing team they're doing a great job because, so in that case, I would say, well, obviously that postcard that we sent had the biggest impact because they didn't respond to anything else. And the patient felt like it was a very personal note from the doctor themselves. And so to answer your question, I think it depends on the person.
You're absolutely right. That is the right answer. Let me just say this. In general, when patients are surveyed and on a large scale, they say, hey, how do you want your doctor to communicate with you? They say text. Okay. The interesting thing about that is that text aren't necessarily what works the best. Okay. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't use text and that text isn't right in the right context and situations. But I'll just put it in this context. If a patient needs to be reminded about an appointment, a text is probably actually the best thing. It's just a quick reminder. Don't forget Tuesday, 3 p.m. Dr. Mann, come on in, right? It's just an easy way to do it. But when it comes to patients who aren't on the schedule and who you need to get to take action, there's a lot of things that start to come into play there. What we find is that even though patients say they prefer text, in the situation where you need to get them to make an appointment, if you can believe it, a live phone call is actually the most effective. Now, I know everyone's like, hey, nobody has time to do those. I just want people to know that statistically, that is the most effective way to get somebody back in. You can answer questions for them. You can, it does take time. From there, if you can believe it, postcards still get the best response rate of the automated methods. Anyway, and that doesn't mean that you shouldn't use auto calls, emails, text. Like, even start with text, emails. And if a patient responds to those, great, but a practice should be willing to use more methods. And it's not, just even thinking about like the auto calls, you can pair the technology with a human, where you say, Guido, it's time for your appointment. Press 1 to be connected to the call center, and then it just patches them through. And that can be more effective than just like a robocall that says, please call our office to make your appointment,
Yeah.
Or if you're doing text and emails, if you've got an online scheduler, have them just click on that thing to take action right at that moment. There are a lot of patients that might be looking at their messages later at night or something, and being able to click right on there and make their appointment. All these things can start to make a little difference that really gets the recall process going better.
And so back to I guess your question to me is, what do people like? The answer is it depends. And most people say text. And that's what I kind of thought, because whenever I remember you approaching me about postcards, and I was like, oh, no way, you're crazy. I mean, that's so 20 years ago. People don't want a postcard. And so when I hear stories about patients coming in because of postcards, it's very surprising. But you're right in terms of you got to keep, what I've seen over the years, you got to continue to do it in different ways and hope that you're going to catch somebody at the right time in one of those channels that they're like, okay, yes, I'm ready. Yeah, and you make it easier for them. I think that's what's evolved too, is continuing to make it easier for them to take action, like putting the link in the text or the email, or putting the button to press 1 on the auto call to get directly to someone. Because if there's something that requires them to wait and then take action later, well, life got in the way between that time. They've likely forgotten, or so other stuff has come up, and it's just not as important anymore. So you got to do it multiple ways and make it easy for them, right?
And that's something you guys do so well, Guido, with your practices. You guys have adopted a ton of technology, but I'll just say it makes it easier to make the decision to use something like postcards when you've got the statistics to see whether they're working. And you guys, obviously through our platform where you're sending the postcards automatically, you're able to see we sent 1,000 postcards. How many patients ended up scheduling their appointment after that step? And it makes it a little bit easier to have that conversation when you know the answer to that.
And as you know from our conversation over the years, I've always been interested in looking at the data of which of those, like when you start maneuvering things and, let's do it at this day versus this day, or have postcards before email or text before, whatever. What's most consistent and what's going to work the best? And so I always try to reach out to the team to have that conversation to say, what are you saying? What's working the best? Let's continue to make those adjustments. Because what I think too, many practices may not understand fully is their life cycle of that. Because you mentioned the live caller being the most the most successful, which I agree. But how do you know when to call versus what's happening automated if you don't have visibility of that process as a whole in the system? There's no logic in there to understand. Because my next question for you is, how much is too much? Because I think when we start to see slower schedules, our inclination is just to throw everything at it, which, may or may not work. But, how much is too much whenever you're reaching out in terms of, maybe that's a hard question for you to answer, but, how do you see that topic of what is too much, or how do you go about that decision-making process?
Well, I'd love to have you give me some feedback on my perspective here and what we think the data shows. So the first is that people get ticked if you're sending them too many messages through the same method too close together. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But if somebody's getting a text and then a little while later an email and a little while later an auto call and then a postcard, maybe even a live phone call, that doesn't feel the same as just like text, 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 text. It's like blowing up your phone, right?
Right. Yeah, for sure.
And then when you have the ability to sort of play the long game with these patients, you can assuage your own conscience that you're not like hitting them too hard, combined with just being politely persistent and giving people a little bit of time to work through their issues. But when you look statistically at how you can contact these patients, people are always like, oh, everybody's got a cell phone today. Well, guess what? They might, but you might not have it on file. I am frequently shocked at how few cell phones are on file for patients who need to be reactivated. It's not uncommon to see only about 75% of those patients with a textable number on file. Email is even lower. And we see these statistics all over the board, but if you're just going to rely on text and emails and you don't even have those on file in the system, how are you going to contact them?
Right.
You got to be willing to use some of these other modalities in those situations to simply even deliver the message.
Agreed. And one thing that you said there made me remind me of a tip is that when you're setting up your practice management, set up your demographics to require a mobile phone number and make that the only phone number if you can. That's what we did years ago because most people have mobile phone numbers anyway, and we had a hard time getting the distinguishing between, mobile and home, and most people don't have a home number anymore, but still, I think you have to make sure that you're getting these things. And then email, I think some people don't want to make it required, but we just make them required. And since we've done that years ago, our data in terms of demographics and reach out is way better than it was because, I think some people are fearful of making those required, or especially email, because then they'll say, oh, well, the patient doesn't want to give it, and then the staff person will just put garbage in that email field. But we, do a good job of educating patients why that's important and why it's important to have your email. We're not going to spam you with marketing message. We want to make sure you get your reminders. We want to make sure that we can set you up with a portal account if you want it, and giving them a little. And since we've made those changes, I think our personal data in terms of demographics has been much cleaner. So I would say that's a tip for any practices in terms of setting up a recall foundation.
My gosh, that's so fundamental, so fundamental.
Absolutely. Well, let's talk about kind of a related topic, but that I think not enough practices think about either, is doing recall, and they also co-manage pretty heavily, or don't heavily, and they're trying to grow their co-management network without external ODs. So I remember, so I think part of the reason that I reached out a long time ago, I remember this long time ago, we was this external OD who we had done surgery on his mother, and got a phone call one day, and he was just like throwing F-bombs and, are you crazy? I'm like, whoa. And like, why are you trying to call in my mother for her annual exam? And so ever since that day, I've been very, I've been very sensitive when it comes to, that our co-managing optometrists and how we reach out and making sure we don't reach out. So what do you think practices should consider when it comes to recall and co-management, other than making sure you don't get yelled and a bunch of F-bombs at you?
Well, here's the deal. To the degree a practice does a good job of scheduling the appointment next and entering a recall to patients, like theoretically that should solve that issue, because otherwise the patient just won't come in. But ideally, you need to put a status on those patients, and you need to have the name of the referring optometrist reliably entered into the practice management system. Otherwise, end up having to turn that process over to, a company like Brevium, where it's like, okay, we can go back through your database, and I'll bet you most ophthalmologists feel comfortable going after like retina patients, because they're like, well, none of my optometrists are really treating retina, so you can bring those patients back.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, it's really important from the standpoint of co-management to log the doctor and the status of the patient, whether they've been returned.
Definitely, I think that most people probably don't understand the capability of their system to do so, because different practice management folk, they approach it differently in terms of how to mark that patient with a correct referring doctor. So that's key. And the other part is making sure that I've seen is that not a lot of recall vendors, to my huge surprise, even take that in consideration. And so when I've had some conversations with, different companies, especially when it came to switching an EMR system and how that particularly EMR's partner vendor handled recall, they're like, well, how do you handle it? Well, we look at the recall date only. And so they're making the assumption that the practice is always going to be perfect at putting a recall date or not. And if the recall date isn't in there, well, then they're not going to reach out. Well, what about that huge bucket of patients that don't have it, but they need to come back? And it's like, oh, okay, well, we can do that. Okay, well, what happens if we do that? And how are you going to exclude referred patients that we don't want to reach out to? Oh, well, we can't do that. Well, you need to take into consideration the whole thing, because all of those things are important, so that, like you mentioned in your example of what's going out of the funnel that you don't realize. So if you get too aggressive, you got to understand how to exclude the patients of those great relationships you have with those outside doctors, that you're not reaching out to their patients. So It can get complicated, but you just have to understand the capabilities of both practice management and also the recall system, and then how those two work together. And so that would be from my perspective over the years of being yelled at and learning my lessons. Another thing that I want to ask you, Steve, was about, I think another thing that maybe people don't think about enough is, if they do consider switching like their practice management system, what are they going to do with their recall database?
Yeah. Whew. You guys have gone through that one too.
We have, yeah.
Okay, here's my experience. These practice management system vendors and EMR vendors, they do a great job, but it seems like as part of the sales process, it's pretty common. They say, hey, we're going to bring everything over to your new system, which their definition of bring everything over to the new system is typically like names, demographics, phone numbers, and stuff like that. To the degree that you can have them bring over like recalls as part of that process, that's really helpful. But the problem that we see is that a lot of times they don't bring over all the old visit history, billing and diagnosis data. And you just talked about it, Guido, the referring relationships
right
from the ODs, right, that send them over. And so just, to make this simple, I'll say be aware of that. Brevium has a process where we'll mine the legacy practice management system database to get all of that information. It's not that we're porting it into the new system, but by taking what's in the new system and having the context of what was in the old system in our views. We call it like stitching the data together. We're able to give practices a seamless view of their patient history so that they can do these types of patient reactivation campaigns, patient recall, and it's super important for patient care. Like, you're able to find those patients with sight-threatening conditions like diabetes and cataracts and glaucoma, and make sure that they're not falling through the cracks. And it's a combination of great patient care. It's also really good for keeping the practice busy. It's good for just the business of ophthalmology, which I think has something to do with this podcast.
Yeah, I agree. And well, Steve, I think we could probably sit here all day and talk about this, and which also shows our age. We were talking about our age and our kids a little earlier before we started, which might be more of an interesting topic than recall. But before we wrap up, if there's any practices out there that are listening and they kind of heard some of these things and maybe they do or don't do some of these things, they want to upgrade their recall campaign, where would you suggest that they get started?
Well, the first thing is, I think that there have been a lot of just practical things that have been shared today that have literally nothing to do with Brevium. It's just doing a better job of data hygiene, collecting information, doing some internal analysis on your own process. Now, to the degree that there's been problems in the past, or just sometimes it's easier to clean that stuff up going forward than it is in the past to fix the old stuff. Certainly, we're an outlet for practices to help them with reactivations. We're experts in recalls, and love to work with anyone there. We can be found at brevium.com. Really easy.
Love it. Well, Steve, I want to thank you so much for joining me today to talk about the science and the art of patient recall. We didn't talk a lot about the art, but maybe the next podcast we can talk more about art.
It's the graphics on your postcard. No, there's a lot of art to it too, with just how long to wait and how long to stay in the game, and you watch your own statistics. Most of the time people respond really well to postcards. Once in a while they don't, but you got to watch your own stats, and you can tweak. That's where the art comes in. You can tweak it to make it work for your own practice.
All right, we'll make that part 2.
Love it.
Thanks again, Steve. I also want to take a moment to thank our listeners. We appreciate each and every one of you. We cannot do what we do without you. If you like our podcast, kindly share it with your friends and on social media. Also, please don't forget to write a review on iTunes or Google Play. Your reviews will help other doctors and practice owners find us. Till we meet again, wishing all of you an amazing week ahead.